Hi, I'm Stephen Carson, coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Welcome to Radical Liberation. Today is an article that I think is a topic that's quite radical, an article that's quite radical, in this day and age at least, where we're attacking an ideal that I think is one of the things at the heart of many of the developments that are pretty disturbing. And I like to cut to the heart of things. And so that's what we're going to do. Very quick shilling, which is that this support gets much appreciated subscribe star. It'd be hard to tell you how much it's been appreciated this week. Anyway, much appreciated subscribe star support. Most people donate $5 a month, and but enough people do that, it starts to really add up to something. So would love your support for the show. Thank you. And then we also have a public Bitcoin wallet for those who like pseudo-anonymous, right? I've been told Bitcoin is not truly anonymous, but pseudonymous pseudo-anonymous way to contribute. Okay, let's get right to it. We have Ryan Turnipseed with us again. Hello, sir.
Hello, how are you?
Very good. We're trying to solidify plans, but Ryan should be here in person. Oh, we didn't talk about it, Ryan, but if you're here for a couple days, maybe we should try to do the show. It wouldn't be on it wouldn't be on the same day, but we could just move it that week. And we'd be very flexible to work around other people because, right, just sometime in the evening when I'm not working and you're here and we can just sit next to each other and do one. We didn't do that before, did we?
We did one live show right before we went to the United States event, but it was on Thursday, so we didn't have to move anything around.
Right, yeah. But anyway, it just occurred to me that would be fun. I mean, why not while you're here anyway, right? Okay, well, unless you feel that I'm making you work while you're here on vacation. But anyway, we can discuss. Okay, so hopefully we'll have a live in-person show, possibly on a different day of the week coming up in June, I'm hoping. We're trying to solidify our plans to have Ryan visit again. And then, I'll wait till the end of the show. We're going to try to do a handoff routine here. We've got Scrump and Evelyn handing off to us as their stream ends, and we are in turn going to hand off to something, but we'll tell you about that at the end. And try to get this into a little more of a network of friends kind of thing going on here. Okay, so I want to get right to the topic. I will give this teaser. Let's consider this show a sort of a part one. Right now, we're going to do the negative case. We're going to attack a reigning ideology or ideal or value that I think you'll agree informs a lot of stuff going on and has been informing for a long time. We're going to go right at the heart of it, I hope. And then one could listen to all this and say, okay, yeah, sure, I agree, but what do we do instead, right? If you don't believe in equality, then what do you believe in? And help convince us that that isn't a horrifying vision in its own right? Because I think for a lot of people, just the word authority, for example, immediately triggers, for some people, frankly, trauma, right, from authority figures who have been abusive. But for others, just maybe a picture they've been given from the media and everything that authority is always an abuse. So this is part one. Part two will be a Mrs. Red Lip stream. If we can get ourselves together, it should be this Saturday. Can't totally promise that yet, but I can promise that it will be a follow-on to this where we will present a positive vision. So this is the negative critique, and then we'll present a positive vision, my wife and I. So with that, let's get to an article by Murray Rothbard. And I want to emphasize when this was written. It's called Egalitarianism as a Revolt Against Nature. And it was written in 1972. Quick rabbit hole, not of interest to most of you, but some people are like, Rothbard was a cringe libertarian, and he was sort of had a dalliance with the New Left, which is true, but maybe not for the reasons you might think. It wasn't because he wanted to smoke pot. Let's put it that way.
Right.
He had this brief alliance with the New Left, and he was a cringe libertarian. And then near the end of his life, he was influenced by like Paul Gottfried and Pat Buchanan and became based. Okay, well, that story is completely false. I hope to cover that soon on Thomas 777's podcast and give the real story. But never mind that. The main point to know is this was written in 1972, well before the late 90s paleo phase, or the not late 90s, sorry, he died in mid 90s, but the 90s paleo phase at the end of Rothbard's life. He was, in fact, really, in my view, a right-winger all along. And I think reading this 1972 article, you'll see why hopefully you'll get a piece of evidence for that claim. Okay, so let me get my twiddling bit. Okay, there we go. All right, so egalitarianism as a revolt against nature. And I said it in the marketing, but just let me repeat it real quick here. He says the left has generally been conceded to have morality, justice, and idealism on its side. And the fake conservative opposition to the left has largely been confined to saying that those ideals are impractical. That would be beautiful, but in theory, it doesn't work out so well in real life. Okay, well, Rothbard wants to go deeper than that and say, well, yeah, it doesn't work, but it's not even a beautiful vision. That is really the heart of what he has to say here.
Right, and he takes a shot at the conservatives that I remember hearing like a couple of years ago, where you get a conservative saying the talking point, oh, well, egalitarianism or socialism or whatever the left is pushing is wonderful in theory, but in practice it just does not work. Right? That's what he's pushing against here.
Right, and as he says, and he said in many other places, well, anyway, we'll get to that, but one more shot at the conservatives. He says the conservative opposition, having staked its all on the seemingly firm ground of the practical, that is, the status quo, is doomed to lose as the status quo moves further in the left direction. And of course, he's describing our life, right? The stance that, well, we can't do that because it hasn't been done. Well, now all the things are being done, right? We're sliding down all the slippery slopes. And who was it? I was just quoting someone saying, I'm not even going to call myself a conservative because there's nothing. Oh, I remember the guy from VDARE, the guy speaking at a VDARE conference. He said, Kirkpatrick, I think, he said, I'm not going to call myself a conservative. What about the current regime do I want to conserve?
Right.
Point to it. Point to the part that we want to keep of our current setup. It's all, rotten and destroyed and needs to be gotten rid of, right?
Right, the entirety, yes.
Right. So anyway, I mentioned this, this thing about, staking the seemingly firm ground of the status quo. I think from our vantage point, that is just laughable at this point. There is no the greatness of the American institutions that are standing behind us, I mean, come on. That's long gone at this point. Okay, so right, more on the practicality. I'm going to skip that a bit, I think. Okay, right. So now back to this thing of the left having the moral high ground, right? In no area has the left been granted justice and morality as extensively and almost universally as in its espousal of massive equality. And he says it's basically rare for anyone to question it. The egalitarian ideal.
Right.
And let's see. Yeah, he goes on to talk about the unquestioned Ideal of egalitarianism. Okay, he's, Rothbard was an economist, and so he draws something from economics. So I'll just give an example. He says, consider, for example, the late Henry C. Simons. After properly criticizing various scientific arguments for progressive taxation, he came out flatly for progression as follows. So I hope you follow there. He said, there's these scientific arguments for progressive taxation. They don't work. I'm for it anyway. Okay, and here's how he explains that. The case for drastic progression in taxation must be rested on the case against inequality, on the ethical or aesthetic judgment that the prevailing distribution of wealth and income reveals a degree and or kind of inequality which is distinctly evil or unlovely. So, and then he quotes Professor John Dew, the consensus of opinion today regards progression as necessary for equity. So what's happening here? They're stating a status quo. Not a status quo necessarily in the sense of what the policies were of the day, though they were going that way by then, but a status quo in terms of the values that everyone was just accepting in an unquestioned way. Right.
Right.
Go ahead.
So basically after World War II, with the you often get a term, the consensus, and that gets used in politics a lot. But there was also just like a sort of social consensus as well, where you saw the accepted opinions slowly get just shaved off until you get to choose a binary, what we've had for like the last 5 years, which is, what the progressives have just left it at, or you can choose the next progressive policy. So in this case, for the economists, it would be just completely supporting progressive taxation. Because if I remember correctly, I think there was a lot of pushback with the implementation of progressive taxation among the field of economics for long after it just got implemented. So you see this in all the different other fields as well: sociology, the sciences, government. It's a status quo, even though they aren't necessarily there yet in actual implementation.
Right. It becomes the fashionable opinion.
Right. Exactly.
Right. It's the sort of thing that if you stood against it at a little party of your fellow university graduated friends, they would look at you like, what's wrong with you, you Neanderthal, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. If you quibble and say, well, I think there's, certain problems with going too fast, that's acceptable. But to fundamentally question the value, to fundamentally question the direction is, right, considered unacceptable. Right.
Exactly.
So he says, he's got some great lines. It's hard to skip through a Rothbard article because his writing is so good. I just want to read it all out, right? But anyway, he says, while candor in proclaiming one's values, like what we just saw from these economists, may be admirable, it is surely not enough. In the quest for truth, it is scarcely sufficient to proclaim one's value judgments as if they must be accepted as tablets from above that are not themselves subject to intellectual criticism and evaluation. Is there no requirement that these value judgments be in some sense valid, meaningful, cogent, true? And so he says, let's take a fun example and think about this in a different way. He says, let's suppose that Professor Simon's, ethical and aesthetic judgment was like this. We should murder all short people, all adults under 5 feet 6 inches in height. And he had then written, the case for the liquidation of all short people must be rested on the case against the existence of short people, on the ethical or aesthetic judgment that the prevailing number of short adults is distinctly evil or unlovely. And I should have had this pulled up already, but some people are probably already in their head singing to themselves Randy Newman's Short People Got No Reason to Live. Very funny song. Making a similar point, I think, in terms of his satire. Okay, so he says, one wonders if people would respond quite the same if he had made that statement. But I think his point is, what's the difference, right? Okay. So he says it's not enough to just proclaim your value judgments. They should be defended in some way. And he says the goal of equality has for too long been treated uncritically and axiomatically as the ethical ideal. And so he wants to open this conversation up. Go ahead, Ren.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's the difference between getting a consensus and having whatever the consensus say is true be what you operate off of, and actually, verifying if it is true. That's the difference that we're operating on here. In which case, egalitarianism or equality is the thing where everyone has reached the consensus. But is it founded in any sort of reality or even morality? We've covered the latter in great detail so far, but we can always expound upon reality.
Right. So, first of all, he says, let's challenge this idea of a radical separation between something that is true in theory, but not valid in practice. Right? And I'm already thinking, Ryan, of all the ways we could apply this, like in terms of our attacks on democracy, right? People are like, oh, but democracy is fuzzy and warm and soft, right?
It's the correct thing for us to have.
Yeah, and sure, the democratic age has been an age of, mass man and, the crushing of the individual and mass murder and so on and so forth. But, you can't, it's good in theory, right? Okay, he says, if a theory is correct, then it does work in practice. If it does not work in practice, then it is a bad theory. This seems like obvious stuff to say, but I remember reading it going, oh, good point. He says, now this is true in ethics as well as anything else. If an ethical idea is inherently impractical, that is, if it cannot work in practice, it is a poor ideal and should be discarded forthwith, right? So, if an ethical goal violates the nature of man and or the universe, and therefore cannot work in practice, then it is a bad ideal and should be dismissed as a goal. So this is great, right? Because this grounds what can be kind of a woolly discussion sometimes, what's ideal, and we kind of burn the incense and get into hippie mode and get dreamy and sing John Lennon's Imagine and stuff like this, right? Here he grounds it and he says, no, a real ideal is going to be grounded in reality, in what works in reality, in the structure of reality. Right? So ideals shouldn't be woolly and fuzzy and dreamy. They should be practical and grounded in, the nature of reality, probably in experience, because experience, especially in regards to social matters, human matters, teaches us about what really works and what doesn't, and so forth, right? So, let's get out of the clouds and let's ground our ideals in practical reality. What works and what doesn't.
Right. It's the difference between saying like we should just get rid of evil and saying maybe we should implement restitution for people that do perpetrate evil against another. One is one it just goes against complete human nature, and the other one is practical, has happened, has benefits, has cons that go along with it.
Right.
It's two completely different things. One is worth talking about.
Right. Yeah. Right. We can have a reasonable conversation about, the restitution model of justice, for example. And talk about, what happened when it's been tried before and what were the consequences, good and bad, and so forth, right? Okay, so just to drive home this point, he says, let's imagine a different ethical goal. And that ethical goal is that all men be able to fly by flapping their arms. Okay? Now, let's assume that the pro-flappers have conceded the beauty and goodness of their goal, but have been criticized as impractical. Okay? What is the result? The result is unending social misery as society tries to continually move in the direction of arm flying. And the preachers of arm flapping make everyone's lives miserable for being either lax or sinful enough not to live up to this ideal. Right? We're always being hectored Does that sound familiar? Being hectored? We're always being hectored because we're not living up to the goal that we should be flying by flapping our arms. Come on, people. You're not trying hard enough. You don't care enough, right? You're heartless.
It's all your fault.
You lack vision. You lack vision, people, right? And he says, okay, well, what do we do in that case? The proper critique is to challenge the ideal goal itself, to point out that the goal itself is impossible in view of the physical nature of man and the universe, and free mankind from this evil goal, right? That's what you do in a case like this. But he says this can never occur so long as the anti-arm flyers continue to be solely in the realm of the practical and to concede ethics and idealism to the high priests of arm flying. It's so fun. The challenge has to take place at the core, at the presumed ethical superiority of a nonsensical goal. So now we can lay out the thesis of the piece here. The same is true of the egalitarian ideal, except that its social consequences are worse than the quest for man flying by flapping his arms. The condition of equality would wreak far more damage upon mankind. Okay, so that's the thesis, and let's see him back it up. First of all, what are we talking about? What is equality? If A and B are equal, if they are identical to each other with respect to a given attribute. So Smith and Jones are both exactly 6 feet in height. That means they are equal in height, right? If two sticks are identical in length, then their lengths are equal, etc. So he argues there is one and only one way then in which any two people can really be equal in the fullest sense, and that is for them to be identical in their attributes. This means that equality of all men, the egalitarian ideal, can only be achieved if all men are precisely uniform, precisely identical with respect to all of their attributes. And so this would be, if we really went for that vision, this would be a world of horror fiction, and that was the inspiration for the thumbnail, right? A world of faceless and identical creatures devoid of all individuality, variety, or special creativity. Because in our differences from each other, we have inequality, right? In the economic sphere, which is a big one that has been pushed for the last few hundred years, right? In the economic sphere, some people, as Ryan is studying, are better at entrepreneurship than other people. And the people who are better at entrepreneurship, well, they have a lot of failures, but some of them, some of the time, have successes. And this results in them having an economic inequality with people who are not so gifted in entrepreneurship, people like me who work for the man and keep, support my family, but I'm never going to be a billionaire. I'm no Steve Jobs, right? So Steve Jobs and I are unequal in that sense.
If you want something to if you want to bolster your point there, and we could probably elaborate on this. I'm not going to explain this just to build up support for a stream on entrepreneurship. If you had first entrepreneurs, the people that predict market conditions and either reap the benefits of their predictions or take the losses. So it's a type. A person can be a worker and an entrepreneur at the same time. It's not, the entrepreneur isn't necessarily an individual. It's a role. So if every single entrepreneur in a society predicted things equally, not good or bad or something like that, just they had the exact same success at predicting something, there would be no entrepreneurial profit. So
right.
We can elaborate that in a entrepreneurship stream, but that inequality right there is what allows us to have actual entrepreneurship.
Right. Yeah, I follow you. Very good. And we can go through all these other things, right? If we're to recognize someone as extraordinarily beautiful or handsome, that means that some other people are not so extraordinarily beautiful or handsome. And so we have an inequality, right? Well, How would we eliminate that inequality? Actually, let's turn to the literature here. He references one book, and I feel like somehow we ended up bringing this up on another stream. This is deja vu here, but anyway, he references two works of literature. One I've read, one I haven't. The one I haven't is by a professor. Um, I'm sorry, L.P. Hartley, called Facial Justice, and he says this is a British anti-utopian novel. Envy is institutionalized by the states making sure that all girls' faces are equally pretty, with medical operations being performed on both beautiful and ugly girls to bring all of their faces up or down to the general common denominator, right? So that would be facial justice. That would be facial equality, right? A nightmare world. And then this is the one I'm very familiar with. And I remember first reading this when I was reading a lot of Vonnegut when I was a teenager and just being blown away. And unfortunately, they made a video version of it. It wasn't very good. Just read the story. It's called Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut. And Vonnegut begins his story with this great line. The year was 2081, and everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law. They were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General. And just because I love this so much, I got to share a little more.
Yeah.
So the handicapping worked partly as follows, again quoting from Vonnegut's short story. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts. And George, while his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was tuned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage of their brains.
Right.
And the story's even better than what you've just heard because it's a story. It actually has an arc, and it's wonderful. Go ahead, Brad.
I remember when I was a freshman in high school, this was one of the first things that I read when that school year started, and I think that I did a report on it or something like that for the English class I was taking.
Excellent.
And it is very good, and it is especially good for those of you in the sort of break free from the modern world crowd, because that's sort of what the plot line follows. So if that interests you and you haven't read the short story, go read it. It's a good read, and it pertains to the topic here.
And not long. Okay, so he says we instinctively feel horror at Facial Justice and Harrison Bergeron because we have an intuitive recognition that men are not uniform, that the species, mankind, is uniquely characterized by a high degree of variety, diversity, differentiation, in short, inequality. And my daughter was just asking me this, Madeline was just asking me this, Ryan. She said, well, yeah, but there's all this like celebration of diversity, right? And so I was explaining to her that this is similar to how the commies celebrated free speech 100 years ago, right? It's just tactical. It's not a true commitment to, what Rothbard has here, a commitment to the glorious diversity of mankind, the differences between people and enjoying those instead of, bemoaning them. It's just tactical. So the commies celebrated free speech because it helped them and their friends. They felt tactically, and now that they're on top. And the only ones who will be benefited by free speech are, deplorables and such, right? They're enemies. They're enemies. Then suddenly we're hearing a lot about how, we can't have free speech anymore, right?
Right. That's a great thing to learn about the left. And it's the reason why calling out hypocrisy or even calling out people calling out hypocrisy doesn't really move anywhere. And that's just because principles for anyone that wields power usually only stay sort of in the fundamental area. They never get expressed fully. Very rarely do you get someone that's ultra powerful and is also an ideologue or an extreme moralist. To anyone playing these sort of power political games, it's always just about whatever gets your side winning and your enemies losing. So the left can change 40 different positions throughout the span of 70 years. And, yes, it's hypocritical, but that's only if you're expecting them to be consistent.
Yeah, no,
They
no, no.
have never.
I would say it's not hypocritical because,
Right,
for say that someone who sincerely values free speech, it looks hypocritical. But from
right,
the point of view of the communists, for example, it's entirely consistent.
right. You're
I,
expecting them to value it. Right,
yeah, no, they have different values and they support what helps move the ball towards the goal of communism, and they opposes the thing that opposes anything that is in their way. There's nothing hypocritical about that. It's extremely consistent, right? It only looks hypocritical if you're trying to put values on them that they don't share.
exactly.
You just have to recognize that they don't really share those values, and they will trick you into thinking they do briefly as a tactical measure. So similarly, that is my view on the current devotion to so-called diversity. There isn't a real love of the differences in mankind. Is that let's put it this way? Do you think the left loves the economic differences that come because some are successful entrepreneurs and some are not successful or just not entrepreneurs at all? Do you think they love that and they celebrate that? I mean, to ask the questions, answer it, right?
Right, and I mean, you could get even spicier than that. Whenever they try to tamper with the demographics of a native population, they never try to preserve the native population alongside the new people. Right? They always, in most cases, each of these organizations that pushed for displacing a native population usually then advocates for completely eliminating that native population culturally, you know, heritagely, all of I think that might be a safer word than any of the other alternatives. Um, so they will say diversity in order to get their power base in there, or in order to cause you grief and strife. But you can tell it's not a commitment because their immediate action is to completely eliminate any and all differences because it makes it easier to control.
Right. So to press that point home, that spicy point home, I would say imagine going to progressive these days and saying, okay, mass immigration has really made the United States super diverse. Don't you feel like it could get to the point where the sort of some of the older cultures of America, the Anglo Americans, the Scots Americans, and so forth that were originally here, that some of that will just be lost, and we'll actually have less diversity because we'll have I don't know, plenty of Mexicans or whatever, but we're going to actually lose some of those traditions that were there before those immigrants came. So we'll actually end up with less diversity. I mean, they'll just laugh in your face, right? And
Right.
they'll say, well, those people deserve it.
Yeah, or they'll decry you for noticing an issue, right?
Yeah, right.
Like that's their other weapon.
Right. Okay, so anyway, let's see. Okay, right. So mankind is characterized by diversity, and there's a beautiful passage, I can't wait to get to it, that drives that home. But anyway, so what he says is then the only way you can actually achieve an egalitarian society, given the reality that mankind is actually just diverse by nature, right? That we have
Right.
diverse gifts, diverse IQs, all et cetera, et cetera. Given that diversity, the only way you can actually get us to be equal is through massive totalitarian coercion. Okay,
Right.
and that means that when you really think through the realization of this goal of equality or egalitarianism, you really end up with a vision that is profoundly anti-human. And so he says the egalitarian goal is, therefore, evil, and any attempts in the direction of such a goal must be considered evil as well. Okay, so he's going to spell out some things, and interestingly, we get two references I noticed in this article, Ryan, to some of the folks that AA has written about recently.
Mm-hmm.
First,
Yeah.
we get the Iron Law of Oligarchy, which is from McKell's, I think.
That sounds right.
Yeah, and then he drops in a little. It's not a as big of a reference, but he drops in a little Carlyle quote somewhere here in the article, I noticed. But anyway, okay, so socially and economically, the variability of man manifests itself in the universal division of labor, right? Which is that we aren't all carpenters and we aren't all farmers. You know, we focus on different things in our jobs. And in the iron law of oligarchy. Now, this starts to hit a little closer to home, right? Because when they're talking about egalitarianism, we should be equal, I think they in particular are talking about we should be equal in authority. It's the idea that, we talked about recently, the commune where we all sit around endlessly discussing to make decisions together.
Right.
Because, no one's above anyone else. Hey, we're all equal here. But Rothbard doesn't accept that. He talks about the iron law of oligarchy, which comes from Robert McKells. And that is the insight that in every organization or activity, a few, generally the most able or the most interested, will end up as leaders, with the mass of the membership filling the ranks of the followers. Now, this applies to government, of course, governance type activities, or state type activities, but it also just applies to like a chess club. The iron law of oligarchy, right?
Exactly.
Most
Anything
members,
that's organized.
Yeah, most members of the chess club want to come and play chess, and they don't want to sit there in a meeting and take minutes while they have the club meeting, and be the treasurer, and all this administrative jazz. They're like, hey,
Right.
I came here to play chess, dude.
The ideological commas are to make sure that everyone is sufficiently excited to play chess.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so most people, and I think very reasonably, I don't like, personally, I do not look down on someone who joins an organization and is happy to just be there for the purpose of the organization and not necessarily get involved with leading the organization. I mean, if all we had was chiefs and no Indians in every organization, it wouldn't work out very well, right? So you need
Right.
some people who come and just want to play chess, and that's fine, and they abide by the rules that have been determined by the leadership of the chess club or whatever, and everything goes well. So
Right.
there's
It's
nothing
not
wrong with
just
this.
You need them.
Yeah, you need them, right. But the point of the iron law of oligarchy is that this always happens, and you can't escape it. And he'll actually give an interesting example soon. Jefferson talked about a natural aristocracy, those who are best attuned to the activity of leadership. And then jumping forward in time, because remember, this is a 1972 article, so he couldn't reference something that didn't exist yet. Hoppe talked about natural elites. Am I thinking the right term, Ryan? I think it's natural elites is what he uses.
Yes, there are so many natural followed by synonyms of aristocracy and elites that I can't keep track with who penned it. That sounds right, yes, for Hoppe.
Yeah. So Hoppe talks about natural elites, again saying that, even and especially in a just natural order, you're going to have those who are the most talented, the most interested, rise up and become, top scientists and so on and so forth. And they are the natural elites that we would turn to when we're trying to, ask a question that they're good at, that's in an area they're good at. Okay, and so Rothbard argues that he thinks this is not random, it is not imposed by society, this diversity. It's rooted in the biological nature of man. And as you might have noticed if you've been watching your memes lately, biology is in the memes these days, right? He says it is precisely such a conclusion about biology and human nature that is the most galling of all possible irritants to our egalitarians. They do not want you to bring up biology, right?
Right.
And in fact, I would say that to some degree, on certain topics, it's just flat out viewed as unacceptable. For example, work on IQ differences in some quarters would just be viewed as like you're essentially a Nazi if you're talking about that or looking into that or doing research on it, right?
Right, exactly. And meanwhile, in some areas, it would just be seen as basic fact.
I'm sorry. I should be more precise, and he's going to be precise. IQ differences rooted in biology. To be specific, if you're gonna do a paper on how the IQ differences are caused by economic inequality, I think you're gonna go far these days, right? But if you
Well, yeah,
go
that's what
ahead,
they do.
yeah,
That's how they explain it away. Especially if you go into an economics class at a university at this point, they will give you the whole equality and you need to make sure that there's equality in like real GDP per capita because that affects people's intelligence and crime rates and IQ and all this other stuff. Um, where I you might think that there are other more important variables that would affect all of those factors. But they will root it all in the sort of equality myth to get people interested in it and to basically funnel any and all research into that specific ideology.
okay, so he says biology must be read out of court quickly and totally. And he goes, now he's going to do another example like the short, killing all the short people, right? He says, let's talk about a common dictum that redheads are excitable. Here's a judgment of inequality, a conclusion that redheads as a group tend to differ from the non-redhead population. They are, heaven protect us, heaven help us, different. Redheads are in some observable way different than other people, than non-redheads. This is terrible, right? The egalitarian sociologist investigates the problem, and he finds that redheads do indeed tend to be more excitable than non-redheads by a statistically significant amount. Now, what's he going to do? Is he going to admit that there's some kind of biological difference? No, he's going to explain that culture is responsible for this. The generally accepted stereotype that redheads are excitable has been instilled into every redheaded child from an early age, and he has been internalizing these judgments, right? It's like internalized misogyny, right? This is internalized, anti-redheadism or whatever. And he's just been acting in the way society expects him to act. That is, redheads have been brainwashed. They have false consciousness, right? To use the left-wing terminology. And he says, okay, well, it's possible that such a process could occur. This seems rather unlikely because the egalitarians implicitly assume that the culture arrives and accumulates haphazardly with no reference to social facts. The idea that redheads are excitable, Rothbard argues, didn't originate out of thin air or as a divine commandment. So how did people get this idea? He says one egalitarian trick is to do psychologizing and say that the public has a psychological need to accuse some social group of excitability, and they picked redheads as the scapegoats. But Rothbard says, well, why redheads? Why not blondes or brunettes? And he says the horrible suspicion begins to loom that perhaps redheads were singled out because they are indeed more excitable, and therefore society's stereotype is simply a general insight into the facts of reality. And this is a much simpler explanation and explains what we observe.
Right, and at this point, don't lose sight of your original, of what we started the scenario with. This is supposed to be science, not trying to make a worldview logically consistent.
Right.
So this will completely infect any and all scientific fields and departments. If you get any ideology similar to this, where if people just accept this is true, and this egalitarianism, for instance, if they accept it's true, that is going to be their basic axiom or their basic fundamental belief or truth, whether or not they've considered it. And every single piece of evidence that they are then going to find, they are going to try to make fit that rather than basing their opinions and beliefs off of what is actually true.
Right. Yes, the underlying assumptions driving like the agenda and even the interpretation of data, right, And in fact, Mises argues that there is no getting away from data. Data does not speak on its own. You always have to, there is no a theoretical way to approach data, but that's a whole different topic. Okay, so egalitarians begin with the a priori axiom that all people, and hence all groups of peoples, are uniform and equal. It then follows for them that any and all group differences in status, prestige, authority in society must be the result of unjust oppression and irrational discrimination. And of course, this is what we've seen. If 50% of the population is female and 50% of the board of directors of all the Fortune 500 companies are not female, boom, oppression, dude. There you go. Take it to the bank. You can start bring the lawsuits, right?
Right, and you can do that with anything else as well. If they wanted to, they can make it about something just as irrelevant. It could be blondes. This percent of the population is blonde-haired. How many are on the board of directors? Not that percent. Discrimination. They've been segregating the blondes out of the workforce and discouraging them, therefore, right? Because it should be clear to anyone. You can try to justify things based off of you can try to play their game and try to explain away why it is that, here's why women haven't been going into it. Or you could just reject the fundamental thing. Why do they have to be? Right? That was one of my big gripes for about 6 or 7 years ago, whenever the main conservative talking points was trying to explain away what the left was talking about instead of just attacking the sort of fundamental groundwork. Whenever every conservative was trying to find out, we'll accept the left statistics. Why are women paid less than men? And they just try to explain it away instead of attacking the fundamental underlying assumption that they should be.
They should be, right? Yeah. Very good, right. Okay, so he gives a few examples of this in practice. One is an interesting one. He talks about the 1972 Democratic Convention and the McGovern movement. And
this is gonna be fun.
Yeah, a few groups are singled out as having been oppressed by virtue of delegates to previous conventions falling below their quotal proportion of the population as a whole. So these groups were seen as having been oppressed because they weren't represented enough in the delegates to the convention. Women, youth, blacks, Chicanos, or the so-called Third World. And so the Democratic Party overrode the choices of the voters to fill out the quotas and make sure that the delegates lined up with these quotas, right?
Right.
Go ahead.
So, if you want a slightly off topic, if you ever want fodder for like a supposed party switch, as if that's a natural thing, just completely ignore whoever told you that the party switched and kind of look at what was happening in the party leadership. Because this is around the time where the Democratic Party goes very, very liberal and their left wing takes over. Why was that? Well, their leadership got rid of their old method of party organization, which sort of kept the more conservative old guard in, and they started giving diversity quotas, like we just read here, where you had certain movements and commissions that went through Democratic Party registration and leadership and national demographics, and basically just said, well, we need this many people from this group to be represented with this power, and they basically just they use that as an excuse to get rid of their conservative old guard. The conservatives at this point would have been New Dealers that were, in favor of segregation or something along those lines. So they would use that to get rid of the old guard and put in their friends, and that's where you sort of see the Democratic Party just launched to the left. It's worth noting, very few people actually switched parties, and I find it very relieving that Rothbard actually talks about the organization, because that's exactly where the issue comes from.
Yeah, so you're saying it wasn't that in 1972 suddenly the Democratic voters changed so drastically. It's that they
Right.
just changed the rules, and suddenly the leadership is different.
Right, exactly. Like the way it's usually put is like Nixon had to, in his first presidential election, had to go against a segregationist and a very left-wing liberal from the Johnson administration. So then the Republicans turned to the right and got all the right-wing voters from both of those groups. And then in 1972, the Democratic Party just went further left and tried to take back the Republicans' left-wing voters, and thus the party switched. No, the party's leadership just completely purged all their ideological opponents and made it into some sort of hellscape ideologically and racially almost.
Right. So um, he talks about, for example, this issue of the youth being underrepresented. And he says, this is crazy. One way to point out how this is crazy, and the youth here is 18 to 25 years of age, right? He says, this is crazy. Rothbard says, this is crazy because you could point out the grievous underrepresentation of 5-year-olds at the convention and urge that the 5-year-old bloc receive its immediate due. And then I thought this passage was fun, Ryan, in light of some private group discussions we had recently. It is only common sense, biological, and social insight to realize that youths win their way into society through a process of apprenticeship. Youths know less and have less experience than mature adults, and so it should be clear why they tend to have less status and authority than their elders. But to accept this would be to cast the egalitarian creed into some substantial doubt. Further, it would fly into the face of the youth worship that has long been a grave problem of American culture. Anyway, a lot packed in there, but
Right.
Rothbard's
Written in
always
the 70s, by
Rothbard,
the way.
yeah, in the 70s, yeah. Rothbard's always getting in some great cultural comments, in the middle of his analysis. So that's youth, and what's his point, right? His point is, it wasn't random that there weren't a lot of 18 to 25-year-old delegates to the Democratic Convention, because you don't put the youngest people in charge usually.
Right.
They have to sort of develop into that.
You get very few Napoleons that at that age can actually do something great.
Right. And then he says, here's another one: women, as the recently discovered oppressed class, they have been usually far below the 50% representation of political delegates that they should be, according to the egalitarian view. And Rothbard says, well, women don't tend to be as politically active as men, and so their numbers were low. I don't know if that's still true, by the way, Ryan. I'm kind of wondering from things I've seen. But anyway.
Yeah, you might see it flip.
Yeah.
That is perfectly conceivable. You've seen it happen in some certain churches, at
Right,
the very least.
Right. So he says this goes up against a long-running historical observation. The women's liberationists can hardly deny the fact that every culture and civilization in history, from the simplest to the most complex, has been dominated by males. And their reply is, from time immemorial, a male-dominated culture has brainwashed oppressed females to confine themselves to nurture, home, and the domestic hearth. Now, one of the problems with this story, by the way, is it's not the kind of story that a man who's been married would ever make up. Because this requires you to believe that women have no influence on their husbands, and they're pleading, please, they're pleading, they're withholding sex, they're using all the many weapons that a wife has to get into a position of leadership, and the man is heroically going, no, wife, I don't care how much you plead with me, I don't care how much you withhold sex, withhold children from me, etc., etc. Stop cooking me meals, I will keep you strapped down in that kitchen, chained in that kitchen. This is just an absurdity. Women are very strong inside the marriage relationship, I can just assure you, as a married man.
Well, and just so that people don't get the wrong idea about that, even in the most explicitly patriarchal societies, you might look for the Eastern Orthodox populations, they are still an influence. The husband does have to take into consideration his wife. That in and of itself is an influence that would
Yeah.
not be present had he not had a wife.
Right. And so Rothbard makes a funny point. He says one neglected reply to all this, this story that, you know, the women have just been oppressed all this time, and we've got to raise their consciousness and get them to realize that they should be on top of everything. You know, he says
Yeah, they're at a lower state of consciousness right now.
Right. One neglected reply is that if indeed men have succeeded in dominating every culture for thousands and thousands of years, this in itself is a demonstration of male superiority. For if all genders are equal, how is it that male domination emerged in every case? So, you know, that's just to be funny, really. But anyway, biology itself is being angrily denied and cast aside. There can be no biological differences between the sexes. Oh, sorry, I just caught a footnote. This is actually going back to the 5-year-old thing. I'm going to read this, and it's going to feel a little different because of recent events, I think. Egalitarians have, among their other activities, been busily at work correcting the English language. The use of the word girl, for example, is now held to grievously demean and degrade female youth, and to imply their natural subservience to adults. As a result, left egalitarians now refer to girls of virtually any age as women, and we may confidently look forward to reading about the activities of a 5-year-old woman. Now, when he wrote that, he probably chuckled and thought that was funny. I would say now it creeps me out because, you know, of the sexualization of children, right?
Right. Well, you could probably make the case that was probably the plan of a few academics when they started doing that.
Yeah, which I shared recently, how long-running the targeting of children has actually been there for 100 years in the left. Okay, so what biological differences are there? He points to Irving Howe, who talks about several important biological differences between the sexes, differences important enough to have lasting social effects. One is maternity, the intimate and integral connection with the child. Again, you just need to have a wife who has a baby, and then you can see this for yourself. 2 is hormonal components that bring about differences. 3 is musculature and physical control are different. Oh, I have a really good point to make on that. In fact, let me do that now. My wife just shared this with me, and it blew my mind. Somebody was doing research on injuries in female athletes, you know, torn ligaments and, you know, stuff like this, serious sports injuries. She found that in every case of a major sports injury, the woman was on her period. Now, why would this be? One of the things that happens when a woman is going into labor, getting prepared to deliver a baby, is that a hormone called relaxin is released. And this relaxes the muscles so that she can open up and let that baby out, right? Well, the same thing happens during the monthly cycle. During a certain part of the month, that same hormone comes out, right? And relaxes the muscles. When you are doing something athletic, you don't want your muscles to be relaxed. You need to be tight. You need to be in control. You need to have that core that's tight, right, etc. And especially for an athlete who is pushing themselves to the very limits of what their body can do to win that race or to go over that, do that pole vault or whatever, a slight bit of relaxation in their muscles due to the effects of their cycle can lead to injury. So I thought that was quite interesting. I just learned this like in the last week from my wife. Okay, and then number 4, the psychological consequences of different sexual postures and possibilities, in particular the fundamental distinction between the active and passive sexual roles as biologically determined in men and women, respectively. So you put all this together, and it adds up to what we've seen historically, which is women tending to be more with the children, men tending to be out there doing things that are physically challenging and risky, etc., etc. Right? All the differences that at one time everybody just understood, took for granted. Okay, and then he gets into intelligence. I'll let you read that on your own. Now, sociologist Arnold Green points to the repeated emergence of what the egalitarians denounce as stereotyped sex roles, even in communities originally dedicated to absolute equality. So I wanted to share this story because it was from Jordan Peterson that I learned this, that in the Scandinavian countries where the attempts to have an egalitarian society have gone furthest, you see the starkest difference in terms of the jobs that people work at. So basically they were like, we want men to be able to have all the opportunities that women to have all the opportunities men have. We're going to break down all barriers, make sure that women get any schooling they need, etc., etc. And the result was you had even more women nurses than men nurses, even more lopsidedly male firefighters versus female firefighters, etc., etc. Right? So,
right.
What about the kibbutzim? If you don't know, the kibbutz, a word that means has a big history for me personally. Anyway, the kibbutzim were communes, basically, in Israel, because Israel had a big socialist component at its founding, at least. And so here's what he says. The phenomenon is worldwide. Men are concentrated in fields which require, women are concentrated in fields which require, singly or in combination, housewifely skills, patience, and routine manual dexterity, sex appeal, contact with children. And the generalization holds for the Israeli kibbutz, with its established ideal of sexual equality. A regression to a separation of women's work from men's work occurred in the division of labor, to a state of affairs which parallels that everywhere else, right? So the kibbutz is dominated by males and traditional male attitudes, on balance to the content of both sexes. So again, they started with this ideal, we're going to break down the repression of the past and we're going to, let everybody do what they want to do. And they ended up back kind of where everybody, cultures throughout history, the way that humans have functioned throughout history, with the division of labor between men and women.
Right. If you completely level the field and just let everything go back to the way develop as it would, you're going to end up much in the same place that you just got done leveling.
Exactly. Yeah. Congratulations, right, for that wasted motion. And so Irving Howe perceives that at the root of the women's liberation movement is resentment against the very existence of women as a distinctive entity. And he's talking about a feminist named Millett, and he says what troubles her most of all is the sheer existence of women. Okay. And she attributes to culture so staggering a range of customs, outrages, and evils that the culture comes to seem a force more immovable and ominous than biology itself. Yeah, now that is a really interesting point, Ryan, right? I'm thinking about how AA is thinking again about biology versus culture in certain matters. Culture, if it is so powerful in influencing how everything works, then we haven't really gone anywhere. Because I think the idea was, okay, we can't do anything about biology. But if we realize that this is more of a culture thing, it's more nurture than nature, well, now we can make changes, right? But then you get this sort of hardening of culture, where culture is gets attributed to it such power to shape people that now culture becomes that hard, immovable object that biology was, right?
Right, exactly.
And now I don't know what progress you've made in terms of feeling that you have freedom to sort of shape people, right, in a different way.
If you were looking at it like that, it almost seems like a misstep, because if you were to alter people's biology, it's very gruesome. If you read into like the Kurt Vonnegut thing that we mentioned earlier, it can get to like mutilation and very disfigurement, all this other stuff. If you wanted to just equalize people biologically. Socially, it's a lot softer. A lot of people don't notice it. You can even market it as a good thing. We're getting rid of this bad behavior amongst the population, like alcohol or something like that was implemented on a national scale. Had a lot of psychologizing and sociology that went behind it. Um, it seems like a misstep to then attribute to culture publicly, at the very least, or academically, absolutely everything that shapes a human. Uh, that is acknowledging the blank slate and then saying, well, this omnipotent entity called culture just influences everything, and it's so pervasive and powerful that you don't even know that you've been influenced by it, and neither does everyone else in society. It kind of takes away the main benefit of social engineering if you were to use it as a tool, and that is specifically, it doesn't sound scary and it doesn't seem that important when you're trying to use it.
Yeah, I'm reminded, Brian, of the big corporate thing on unconscious bias. I've actually been in an unconscious bias training, right? So this is like, it's the ghost in the machine, It's
Yeah.
like, do I have bias in there? And I don't even know it? Okay. Where do I want to go to here? Okay, so Joan Didion says that she thinks that the women's liberation movement is not just a rebellion against biology, but against the very organization of nature itself. And remember the title of the piece here, Egalitarianism is a Revolt against Nature. And she says, if the necessity for conventional reproduction of the species seemed unfair to women, then let us transcend, via technology, the very organization of nature. The oppression, as Shulamith Firestone saw it, that goes back through recorded history to the animal kingdom itself. I accept the universe, Margaret Fuller had finally allowed. Shulamith Firestone did not. Oh, and then I have to read the next line just to get the Carlyle reference. To which one is tempted to paraphrase Carlyle's admonition, "Egad, madam, you'd better." Right, so this reminds me of a story I saw. Didn't you see this? There's going to be like a womb transplant into a man. Are they going to try to do that?
Yeah.
Right?
I've unfortunately seen a few stories about that, so...
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't dig into it to see if there's anything to it. But transcend via technology the very organization of nature, right? We can replace, we can rebuild it. We have the technology, right? So now this one really hits home with recent stuff going on. He says another widening rebellion against biological sex norms, as well as against natural diversity, has been the recently growing call for bisexuality by left intellectuals. In fact, we were, I think AA was just looking at these stats, and he found something curious, which is you have people identifying as bisexual who only have partners of the other sex.
Right. And if you go to an American high school anytime in the last 5 years, you probably know probably every single person that claims to be bisexual only ever has partners of the opposite sex, which should make the whole thing a little bit strange. Perhaps it's not just about attraction. Perhaps there's something deeper there that's been pushed onto people.
Right. But just to show that here he is in 72 talking about the push for bisexuality, and here we are in 2022. What is that? 50 years? 50 years later, and we've got, junior high kids probably, right, Ryan? Saying, oh yeah, I'm a bi.
Right, yeah. If you go to a middle school, 6th through 8th grade, you could probably find a lot of rainbow flags, a lot of people talking about their sexuality and all this other stuff. Keep in mind, these people are anywhere between, 11, 12, and 15 years old.
Right.
So just keep that in mind as you think about these things that have grown to develop, probably unnaturally.
Yeah. So what is the point of this? The point is to avoid the rigid, stereotyped heterosexuality. And if we have bisexuality, that will expand our consciousness. It will eliminate artificial distinctions between the sexes and make all persons simply and unisexually human. That is, what's the point of all this? At least one of the points that Rothbard's pointing to, it's the egalitarian goal. We don't want these distinct men and distinct women. we want to blur that and kind of wash it away, because remember, diversity is just the proclamation of diversity as a tactic. The actual goal seems to be more of an egalitarian goal, right? It's to destroy differences, as I wrote about on my Substack.
Yeah.
So he says we need to get rid of the brainwashing of the heterosexual oppression. Then every individual could reach his or her fullest humanity in the, quote, polymorphous perversity, so dear to the hearts of such leading New Left social philosophers as Norman O. Brown and, oh, look at that, Herbert Marcuse. We've heard of him.
Yes, we have.
And Rothbard was thinking about him in 72. Okay, so in contrast to all this, biology stands like a rock in the face of egalitarian fantasies, and this has become increasingly clear. Now, this is a slightly lengthy passage from biochemist Roger J. Williams, but I thought this was sort of beautiful, actually. He repeatedly emphasized the great range of individual diversity throughout the entire human organism. He says, individuals differ from each other, even in the minutest details of anatomy and body chemistry and physics, finger and toe prints, microscopic texture of hair pattern on the body, ridges and moons on the finger and toenails, thickness of skin, its color, its tendency to blister, distribution of nerve endings on the surface of the body, size and shape of ears, of ear canals, of semicircular canals, length of fingers, character of brain waves, the tiny electrical impulses given off by the brain. The exact number of muscles in the body varies. I didn't know that. Heart action, strength of blood vessels, blood groups, the rate of clotting of blood, and so on, almost ad infinitum. We now know a great deal about how inheritance works, and how it is not only possible, but certain, that every human being possesses by inheritance an exceedingly complex mosaic, composed of thousands of items, which is distinctive for him alone. Now, for some reason, I think there are people for whom this is a nightmare, what he's beautifully describing here. Whereas for me, my response is, give the glory to God, right? This is beautiful.
Cool.
Yeah, it's neat, right? And not to come down from the exalted feelings I'm feeling reading this, but it's also sort of just practical, right? It means that there are people who are a better fit for some things than others. And with this great diversity, you have someone who, through his biological traits, as well as his, just his calling, his personality, his interests, he finds that he wants to go out into the desert and save endangered lizards or something in the middle of the Nevada desert, right? And he is able to do it physically. He's fit. He can handle the desert climate. He's interested in it. He has the attention to detail required. I mean, that's so cool, right? There's so many strange little niches you could think of all over the world, and we can find people to fill them because we have this diversity in the human race, right?
To sort of summarize all of that, it means that due to the most minute and tiny of differences that most people won't specifically know for their lifetime. I mean, if someone knows like how thick each layer of their skin is, it seems a bit terrifying. But like each of those differences means that each person has a vocation that they can fill, to their best qualities, better than other people can. It means that every person has a place, if you will.
Right. Yeah, a fit. I like that. I like the term fit. There's a job that fits for them. There's a mate, a spouse that is a good fit for them, etc., etc.
Right, and that's something that you lose if you just equalize everything.
Right, now he gets into spicy territory here, and notice who he cites. Get ready. The genetic basis for inequality of intelligence has become increasingly evident. despite the emotional abuse heaped upon such studies by fellow scientists as well as the lay public. Now, one of the ways they do this is they study identical twins who are raised in contrasting environments. Every time I learn about twin studies, Ryan, I think the same thing. Why are they separating all these identical twins? That's terrible, Well, I have identical twins, so my heart goes out every time I read about these twin studies. Where are they finding all these twins getting separated? Anyway, studies of identical twins raised in contrasting environments have been among the ways that this conclusion has been reached, and Professor Richard Herrnstein, who you should know from The Bell Curve, co-authored with Charles Murray, okay? Professor Richard Herrnstein has recently estimated that 80% of the variability in human intelligence is genetic in origin. Herrnstein concludes that any political attempts to provide environmental equality for all citizens will only intensify the degree of socioeconomic differences caused by genetic variability. So he says basically, you're better off to just acknowledge the reality of biological differences in intelligence and roll with it rather than trying to fight it, because in fighting it, you actually cause more problems. You actually cause more trouble.
Right.
So anyway, I thought that was really interesting that he's citing Herrnstein back in 72. The references to an Atlantic Monthly article called IQ in the September 1971 issue. That might be interesting to read. Anyway, so the egalitarian revolt against biological reality, as significant as it is only a subset of a deeper revolt against the ontological structure of reality itself, against the very organization of nature, against the universe as such. At the heart of the egalitarian left is the pathological belief that there is no structure of reality, that all the world is a tabula rasa that can be changed at any moment, in any desired direction by the mere exercise of human will. In short, that reality can be instantly transformed by the mere wish or whim of human beings. Surely this sort of infantile thinking is at the heart of Herbert Marcuse's passionate call for the comprehensive negation of the existing structure of reality, and for its transformation into what he defines to be its true potential. I had to read that whole paragraph because that is a keeper, that whole paragraph. And it seems to me that what he wrote about in 72, we are seeing, it has played out even more clearly by now, 50 years later.
Right.
Right.
And it will only continue to do so as transhumanism becomes a thing.
Right. Yeah. I suppose I don't know much about what transhumanism is. Can you relate it to this vision of, transforming reality by our will, by our whim?
There's 40 different types of transhumanism, and there's like more subtler ways. But I'll take like the popular conception, which is just like you basically just alter yourself with technology, either by bionics, like the sci-fi thing of like replacing a limb with a bionic limb and it's better, or altering your intelligence or your brain or something like that with surgeries or implants or the popular conception. All those will work for the purposes of this, even though there are different types. With transhumanism, all that you're going to see is everyone's just going to be completely equalized, because there will be one thing determined to be the best for whatever broad category, whatever broad empirical category has been decided for you, and that's what you're going to have to conform to. And also, there's the much more prescient point that the fact that altering the human body in such a way, just completely scrapping it for something entirely man-made, should very rightly be seen as a complete destruction of the structure of reality that you inherit, right? Like I can't think of anything more destructive than mutilating the human body and replacing the thing that you just mutilated with something entirely man-made.
Right.
I mean, that's like the pop.
We are living this, aren't we? Yeah, and you're saying that for the transhumanists, we're just at the beginning of this road. They want to do a lot more than what we've seen so far.
Right. A lot of your social engineering, where they will try to alter human digestive systems. There was one guy, I believe, at the World Economic Forum that talked about releasing a virus that made people allergic to meat to alter human diets. Like that is a
Wow.
form of transhumanism. So you see all of these attempts. They go against the natural order that you inherit. Like, you don't have to read a book about this. You can just look at yourself and notice your own habits and see this is the natural order. And then you can also look out there. What on earth happens if this becomes the norm, if this becomes standard? God help us.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Anyway, just wanted to leave that passage up on the screen a bit, read it in full, discuss it a bit, because it feels relevant somehow. You know what I mean, Ryan? Okay, so then he does a bit on socialism, which uncharacteristically for the show, I'm not going to do because I just feel like we've really covered it. How crazy the communist fantasies are, and we're all going to do everything in communism and so forth.
Right.
This is nice, though, from Alexander Gray's critique of communism. He says that each individual should have the opportunity of developing all his faculties, physical and mental, in all directions, is a dream which will cheer the vision only of the simple-minded, oblivious of the restrictions imposed by the narrow limits of human life. For life is a series of acts of choice. In each choice is at the same time a renunciation. Yeah, this is one of the reasons I think why Austrian economics has pretty much been very sane for a long time, because right at the beginning of Austrian economics is a recognition of the significance of choice. So it sort of pays tribute that man does act, man chooses, but also that every act of choice, as Alexander Gray here says, is a renunciation. We have a technical term for it. We call it opportunity cost, but that's right at the beginning of Austrian analysis, is that to choose A is to not choose B, right? And so that life is trade-offs is just baked in from the beginning of an Austrian analysis of human choice. And so I see much less among Austrians this kind of idea that we can do everything, but it's very big in communism. Okay, so just to wrap it up then, here's concluding remarks from Rothbard. So we began by considering the common view that the egalitarians, despite a modicum of impracticality, have ethics and moral idealism on their side. We end with the conclusion that egalitarians, however intelligent as individuals, deny the very basis of human intelligence and of human reason, which is the ability to, the choice and ability to identify the structure of reality, of the laws of human nature, the laws of the universe. In so doing, the egalitarians are acting as terribly spoiled children, denying the structure of reality on behalf of the rapid materialization of their own absurd fantasies. And since their methodology and their goals deny the very structure of humanity and of the universe, the egalitarians are profoundly anti-human, and therefore their ideology and their activities may be set down as profoundly evil as well. So I'm going to turn from this and just go back to the two of us. I guess one thing I wanted to make sure to do. Oops, went to the one where Black Horse is on the screen. He's not here. Okay. I wanted to make sure we did a whole series on him, but I did want to make sure to bring up the name Eric Kanolt-Ledeen. He personally influenced me on this very issue. He was very strong on this, that against equality. The book we talked about, in fact, was called Liberty or Equality, right? He saw equality as incompatible with liberty. He gave no quarter to the idea of equality being a valuable goal. I remember hearing him speak, and he said, God loves everyone equally. Did Jesus love John, the apostle whom he loved, or the disciple whom he loved, and Judas the same? he would not give any quarter. It was interesting, Ryan. I don't know that you would have seen, but as I shared the promotion for this series on the various social media platforms, I had people coming back and saying, "Well, no, they're coping, you know, and trying to defend the
Really?
idea of equality." Yeah, here, maybe I can bring one up really quick. I didn't get that many comments. Let's see. Here we go. Um, yeah, a commenter on Telegram says, "Is it equality?" Because I talked about, being against equality and it being a terrible vision of life. Uh,
Right.
she says, "Is it equality or the distorted perception of what it means to be equal? To me, equality is how God made his children, but that doesn't mean he made them all the same." And I'm like,
Yeah.
what? Yes, he didn't make
If
them all the same. So,
if you could allow me a second to talk about that, because
please.
um there's a great deal of thought spent in the right wing at this point among the non-Christians, talking about how soft and basically just regime affirming most of Christianity has become. And at the heart of a lot of this is the idea that, well, um, God just loves everyone equally. Everyone is made equally before God. We're all equally condemned before God, and therefore everyone's equal in the metaphysical sense. And they completely ignore such passages. Uh, do you remember the Jacob I loved and Esau I hated? Uh,
Right,
that's one example.
right.
And you'll get other things as well. Um, if this axiom is true, and this is why it can be so dangerous for you Christians, if this idea is true, then you have a very, very difficult time explaining away God just completely wiping out whole groups of people. Um, the typical counter argument is to say, well, those people brought it upon themselves. But this then contradicts the previous point of everyone is equally condemned, right? If they brought it upon themselves, then didn't the other people that God brought to victory? So
Right, yeah,
you,
which yeah, I have to bring in the Clint Eastwood line. We've all got it coming, kid.
right.
Right,
So if God is this extreme egalitarian, it completely contradicts Christian doctrine and itself becomes a heresy. You either throw out the Old Testament, which is what a lot of the mainline has done. I doubt you would go to a ELCA church and hear them preaching on the law, for instance. Um, or you try to rewrite the Old Testament, which is what the more, I would say, well intentioned, but being as they rewrite centuries of doctrine, not really. They'll say, oh well, it doesn't actually mean that God hated Esau and loved Jacob. It's a mistranslation. In reality, it means he favored or something like that, which you then have to explain away again. But you just see them rewrite all these traditions, and it is itself a non-Christian heresy. You can go back through the entire history of Christendom, and you won't find it. So when those groups of people attack this sort of the non-Christians on the right attack this idea about Christianity being equal, they're half right, and that the idea definitely exists and it's wrong. But they're wrong in the sense that it's not Christianity as any Christian would know it. So it's a pervasive idea, as we see by people going to your Telegram and trying to say, well, equality is good because God. Well, is it? Right, right, exactly. Right. So that's my like little on slightly on topic rant over. You can it pervades everything. Right. Hold on. People saying you're muted.
sorry, thank you. Okay, reading a comment from Nathan Hood. Evil cannot stand free choice, for it cannot control it. Good cherishes free choice, even if those choices are sadly evil, because it does not seek to dominate. I thought that was really interesting comment on that. Okay. I think that is mostly what we wanted to cover. I want to point to two things. One, as I said, is that a Mrs. Radlib stream coming, it should be coming here, hopefully Saturday, where we will talk about the positive vision. If the negative point here is correct, that egalitarianism is a false ideal, then what is a good ideal for what is a good vision of mankind and of how we relate to each other and of authority? And so we're going to try to keep it spicy with that stream and go right at something that is not fashionable to talk about. Furthermore, we are trying to do handoffs. Evelyn and Scrump, friends of the show, have been starting their show around the time I plan to start mine, but usually don't. Anyway, when they finish theirs, they try to send people our way. So similarly, I would like to send you off to something this evening, and it's not for a while, so there's time. It's in a little over 2 hours. Our friend Semiagog will be on a show with on a channel with Jay Burden, the Jay Burden Show. And it turns out that Turnip can make a comment. Let me share that link while you talk about that.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you might not. I hadn't have come across him until he asked to interview me. Jay Burden, you will hopefully be tuning in tonight with me to listen to Semiagog's interview. They will be talking about Gen X. Mr. Burden does a great job at picking topics very relevant to the guests. I was on just this last Tuesday to talk about, is the Reformation really the source of the pause, and is America then a Protestant country, and just sort of about general Protestantism. So what you might notice if you go there is that Mr. Burden is a very excellent interviewer. He has the voice for it, certainly, and he has the demeanor. I found it to be a very pleasant conversation when I was on. So hopefully we will see you all over there to go support our friends and some new talent as well.
Yeah, I noticed he has a very small number of subscribers, so I assume he's kind of just getting started. So what a great... this is fun, right? Because, you go watch a PewDiePie stream and no one knows, right? You go watch this and make a comment and it's like you've now, doubled the activity of the chat or something,
Right, yeah. We are much less parasocial. We will interact with our audience, I would like to think.
Right. Yeah, so I've dropped that link in the live chat to catch Semiagog in about 2 hours with Jay Burden. We're trying to sort of, we don't have it formalized yet, but we're trying to head towards sort of a network type of thing where hopefully you'll be able to see a schedule, or there'll be handoffs, or both. Anyway, in one way or another, you get plugged in to us and our friends, and we'll point you to other great content. Because it can be a little hard to find these things, especially because the powers that be don't necessarily want you to find us that much, right? I don't know that my channel's suppressed necessarily. I haven't tried to figure it out, but
I mean, I remember older YouTube. I'm not gonna say I remember the old days, because then that signals to people like times when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. Like, I remember the algorithm used to suggest to me people like Sargon when he was much littler, and you've seen where that's led most people that took that sort of route. I don't think the algorithm would suggest such a person, let alone this show, which is a bit more spicier than early Sargon.
Yeah, I don't know if the algo's working for us at this point or not. Actually, there are stats I can look at, because it'll tell you. I haven't even found them, but I'm pretty sure I could see how many people is the algo just leading to the channel, or to the and how much is it that people are just coming in from Twitter or some other place, right?
Right.
So I could actually do a little scientific measurement, but Hard to say. I would say, let's put it this way. Something you can do for the show that costs you nothing but time is just making recommendations, sharing the show, telling a friend who you think would find the show interesting. If you've listened to the show yourself for a while, you kind of know what we do. And so you can probably think of some people in your life who would be likely to find it interesting. That is probably the way we really grow, frankly, is a lot of just friends of friends,
Right. I know that's how I share it. A topic will come up in conversation, and I'm like, hey, there's a stream on this, or we've talked about this before, and we went really deep into it. Here's if you're interested, go check it out. We have the benefit where we don't just assume that everyone knows everything going into the topic, so we give a much gentler introduction, I found, than other resources. So it's much easier to just go to if you're in a conversation with like a very normal person, you can just say, hey, check this out, and not have to like explain anything else. You can just say, here's like the introduction and the conclusion, basically.
Right. I mean, I'm sure there's downsides to it, but unlike our friend Academic Agent, I think there's very little insider lingo here and jargon, where you have to have been watching for a year to have any idea what we're talking about.
Right.
You can just jump into any of our episodes and probably follow along pretty well, I hope. So, okay, cool. Well, thanks very much, Ryan. I think we are done. Let me make sure I'm not missing anything. Yes, I think we're done. And looking forward to an Econ Minis next week, I believe. And then maybe that live show the week after that. We're still trying to nail down our week, but hoping for June.
Yes.
So, okay.
That 26 through 29, I think it was. So that's
really?
what I would
okay.
shoot for.
Oh, okay. Maybe it'll be then. Okay. We'll have to figure that out. All right. So we did the handoff. Catch Semiagog. Link in the live chat in a couple hours. And all right. I think we're done. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.